We're talking federal transportation policy under the President Joe Biden administration and the Secretary Pete Buttigieg Department of Transportation, what that means for passenger rail, cars and trucks, vehicle safety, pedestrians and cyclists, and everything else. My name is Michael Sweeney, and this is episode 5 of the Next American Built Environment. Very excited to have joining me today, Aaron W. Gordon. Aaron is a senior staff writer at Motherboard and one of the absolute top reporters covering the transportation beat in the United States. Without further ado, here is our interview with Aaron. Aaron, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So what sort of federal transportation projects do you think we're going to see in the Biden administration? Do you think what's going to be included in a congressional package is going to be this, maybe something different than usual in terms of like more pedestrian money, more cycling money, more rail money, or are we going to see just like a lot of freeway dollars?
I think that's basically the big question from a transportation standpoint facing the Biden administration at this point. He's done a good job so far signaling and also issuing some executive orders that make it pretty clear that he's taking climate change and the climate problem very seriously, at least from an administration standpoint. What we don't know yet is how much that's going to extend to what Congress does, essentially, because obviously these types of projects typically would need congressional approval if they're going to significantly change the way business is done in Washington. And I think that's basically the big question I have about where the Biden administration is going to go in terms of like whether the allocation for money is going to change significantly between like highway projects and transit projects or bike and pedestrian projects. I think one of the interesting things to watch is how much the transportation projects and the money for it allocated by Congress gets sold as stimulus projects to make up for the recession or as climate projects to make our transportation system more resilient, some combination of both therein, or just like kind of where the rhetoric goes, because some of the more moderate Democrats are talking about, like Joe Manchin from West Virginia, are talking about transportation projects much more in the realm of economic stimulus. And in that case, they're going to be relatively agnostic about what kinds of transportation projects are funded in theory, but also they tend to be older guard types who think federal transportation dollars are mostly for highways. And snapping them out of that is going to be a huge challenge. So I think that's one of the things I'm watching. I know that's not like a solid yes, no answer. Like, yes, we're going to see more trains for everybody. Everyone's all gung-ho because Joe Biden likes Amtrak. And so they're thinking this is going to be great for Amtrak. And yeah, it's going to be better than the Trump administration was for sure. But whether it's like, there's a little like, whether it's more Obama-esque where it's like there's $8 billion more for transit than there was before, or whether it's, something that totally shakes up the American transportation funding landscape is yet to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy to imagine like a world where like a lot of the extra Amtrak funding just goes to like restoring these long distance routes that were cut during the Trump administration that aren't actually very useful. There was that. You don't know the name of the route, but whatever one ran through West Virginia, I think did get cut, and it would be easy to see that come back. But that's also like not really. It's hard to get excited about that, I think.
Yeah, and there's also like it's very likely there's going to be more money for transit than there was before, but more money doesn't automatically translate to better outcomes, especially when it comes to federal transportation policy. So that's like another big thing to watch too, is where the money is actually going and how much it's going to say. Allow DOT to kick in money for some new starts in some cities that are like expanding a light rail infrastructure that are basically going for like the Dallas model of having 100 miles of rail that nobody uses, or how much it's to like make sure that the 100 miles of rail getting built is in places that people will actually use it. So I think that's another like key question to kind of keep our eyes and ears on as well.
Yeah. So like one of the big questions that I've had, and I know this is something that you've covered a lot, is there like a sense within Congress or within the DOT that they want to tackle the kind of cost inflation and the like absurd costs of new transit projects in the country? Or is that something that's like not really on their radar?
No, it's not on their radar at all. I mean, it's something that almost nobody at the federal level talks about. And I think one of the interesting things, too, is going to be if that comes up during all these stimulus, if if all of this is kind of discussed within the realms of an economic stimulus package, which I think is likely, that seems to be the way to get something like this passed. I mean, and especially at this time. If that's the way we're talking about it, then talking about like bringing costs down will sound strange to some people who are like, who cares the stimulus? Just get money out the door, spend the money. That's like the point of this. I don't think that's right. Like, let me be clear. I think that's like a bad way to think about spending federal transportation dollars, but it's not the kind of environment that's conducive to thinking about being cost effective and efficient with money and blowing up ways that we've basically done things in this country for decades that waste a lot of money on transportation projects. But this was the case even before coronavirus and even before we started talking about transportation projects as kind of like a stimulus package. Even when costs of like the Second Avenue subway were getting a lot of press coverage in New York, thanks in big part to the excellent New York Times expose on how expensive it was and why it was expensive, it just like petered out. Like it didn't go anywhere. The MTA was like, oh yeah, we'll like put together a task force and look into this. And then every member of the board who was a part of that task force has left, and then it's like, I think it was OMB, the Office of Management and Budget on the federal level. I might be mistaken with another agency, but some federal agency also did an investigation into construction costs. And there were high hopes that was going to lead somewhere, but the report was terrible. It was basically like an annotated version of a bunch of media reports. It was like actually a high school homework assignment. So I think, and that was it. And there hasn't been any talks about construction costs on the federal level that I've seen since then. So I think we can very much expect the status quo where that's concerned.
Yeah, I remember when that New York Times report you referenced came out, and I was like so excited to read it because it was like, this is something that we've been talking about forever, and it seems so on its face scandalous. And then, as you said, like basically nothing happened with it. Like no one really seemed to look into it. I mean, there was
nothing happened, and phase 2 is going to be even more expensive per mile than phase 1. Like it's just like it's almost funny how like it seems like everyone who's responsible for this stuff took it as a challenge to waste even more money on future transportation projects because like, hey, everybody knows about it now and it's just like clearly accepted. So why not just, keep doing it?
I don't have the piece in front of me, but I mean, there was like a detail in the first few paragraphs, if I recall correctly, where they're like, oh, there were like 900 guys who were working for the, I can't remember if it was Second Avenue or the East Side Access. And no one could figure out what they did, and they were just like on the payroll. Yeah. And it's like, that's such an alarm bell where it's like, shouldn't like the DA be looking into this or something? And there was, as far as I can tell, no follow-up.
Yeah, there are like roughly a half dozen agencies on the local and federal level who could potentially claim ownership of this issue, but they don't.
So in addition to like whatever is happening in Congress, we have a new DOT Secretary, Pete Buttigieg, who's coming to this from like I don't know, I think it's an unusual background for a DOT secretary to have been this small city mayor. He's very young, doesn't have like necessarily a lot of transportation background. What do you expect Buttigieg's tenure at DOT to be like? Do you think there's like a lot that DOT could do unilaterally? I know like these capital projects require congressional approval, but what do you expect Buttigieg to be up to at DOT?
Well, so the congressional projects don't require congressional approval. I'm sorry, these big transit projects don't require congressional approval individually. What requires congressional approval is the funding allocation for all of them. And then DOT basically grades the projects on an individual basis when cities or states or transit agencies ask for funding for it. And then based on those grades, they then decide what to fund and what not to fund. But the limitation is how much money they have to spend on these transportation projects. It's not like wrong to say they require congressional approval in a philosophical sense, but on a practical level, it's not like DOT goes to Congress and says, approve the Second Avenue subway. Instead, Congress says we're allocating, $10 billion for you this year or something like that to put towards transit projects. And DOT has to decide which of the dozens of projects facing before them, which cost way more than $10 billion in aggregate, they're going to actually fund. So I don't actually expect that much to change in terms of how DOT funds transit projects, because that's pretty much been set in stone for 30 years-ish, in terms of like how they grade, what they take into account, what's important, what's not important, what they like, what they don't like. All that's pretty much set in stone. Instead, what I think DOT can do is what a DOT commissioner what the Secretary of Transportation can do kind of on his own without much congressional approval that would make a big difference has a lot more to do with enforcing rules already on the books that DOT pretty much ignores or at least doesn't strenuously enforce right now. And so here I'm thinking a lot of like what NHTSA does, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration. I'm thinking mostly what they do, actually, because a lot of what they do is related to enforcing fuel economy standards, enforcing rules about vehicle safety standards. And this is something that we've seen the federal government really drop the ball on, especially in the last decade or two, with the rise of SUVs and pickup trucks and the resulting rise in pedestrian fatalities that has resulted from people driving bigger cars that are less safe. And also just lacks fuel economy standard, both the standards and the actual enforcing of those standards. So like one thing that we've seen recently is this big report that found that a lot of trucks, especially diesel trucks, basically have their catalytic converters removed or modified per not in the factory in which they're made, but after someone buys them. And people just do this because they like want their cars to get worse gas mileage, because it's like, screw you to own the libs. It's like actually very strange. They say it's a performance thing, but like I've talked to some people who know cars really well, and they say like it doesn't really add that much performance. So it's just a strange thing. But anyway, people do it in huge numbers, and it hurts the environment because it hugely increases emissions, especially from nitrous oxide as opposed to CO2, which is much more harmful for the environment per ton than CO2. And this is something that like these rules are on the books that you can't do this. You don't need to pass any new laws or issue any new rules. You just need to actually get like some enforcement behind it. And to DOT's credit, they actually did start to step this up a little bit recently, but they can lean on states especially a lot more to start enforcing this a lot more stringently. And it would have a huge positive impact, but it requires just like, actually doing it.
Yeah. And like you know more about this than me, but the impression that I get is like people consider NHTSA to be sort of captured by the auto industry, or to be like a little too cozy with the auto industry, given what their role is supposed to be in regulating them.
Yeah, that's right. There's a whole history here that I'm sure we don't have time to get into, but, it goes back to Ralph Nader's big investigation, Unsafe at Any Speed, back in the 60s, if I'm not mistaken, which ultimately kind of resulted in NHTSA being created. And from catalytic converters to airbags to seat belts, the story is always the same. NHTSA says, this is a good idea and it won't cost people any money and it'll save a ton of lives. You have to do this now. And car companies say, this will literally put us out of business if you make us do this. Like, we will literally cease to exist as companies if we have to put restraining belts in our vehicles. And of course, this is complete hogwash, whether it's, the next year or 10 years later. Eventually they have to do it. And it turns out to be totally fine and nothing bad happens, except lots of lives are saved, which is good. So it's like, yeah, so there's a long history there, and the reason I brought up NHTSA, the other reason I brought up NHTSA is because Buttigieg's appointee to head NHTSA, I'm totally blanking on his name right now, but he comes from the California Air Resources Board, and he was one of the key players in kind of the whole Trump fuel economy emissions rollback scandal. So that's actually a super interesting appointment that I'm really excited to see what he does, because he's not the typical NHTSA, like you say, like kind of auto industry insider who kind of straddles both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, the California Air Resources Board, kind of the opposite reputation as being very, very tough on the car companies and very tough on polluters. And if I recall correctly, they were like kind of the ones that broke Dieselgate, or were at least involved in that, right?
Yeah, they were involved in that. I'm trying to remember something I read years before, so forgive me if this is wrong, but it was something like these independent researchers based out of West Virginia contacted CARB and worked together with them on kind of like breaking Dieselgate. Yeah.
This will probably have higher stakes than it normally would because of autonomous vehicles becoming so prevalent and the rules around that. There's been kind of this weird, I don't know if it's a contradiction or just kind of a disunity where certain parts of DOT seem much tougher on the AV companies. Like NHTSA seems like they've taken a really indulgent attitude, and then the Transportation Safety Board, the people who investigate airline crashes, whenever they do an investigation of an AV crash, that seems much more damning, the conclusions that come out of it. So I wonder if that's something that's going to get resolved in the Buttigieg DOT.
Yeah, they're an independent agency, and that's what. And you know, it's actually an important point. It's one of the reasons why NTSB is so good, is that they're not a part of a government agency. There's no ladder up to the president's office. They're appointees, a bipartisan group of appointees, and it's actually one of. I mean, I'm not like an authoritative expert on the subject of like what the best government agency is, but NTSB is pretty high on the list. Like when NTSB does an investigation and says something happened, you tend to not get a ton of people who come out and be like, that's not true. NTSB is part of the rogue state or whatever. Like people believe it. And I think that's happened a bunch with Tesla crashes, especially is the Tesla and the Uber self-driving crash. They've done extremely thorough and conclusive investigations into what happened, assigning responsibility. And I mean, Elon Musk tweets angrily about it, but that's pretty much it. And when they conclude these investigations, they pretty much they're very direct in the hearings where the board members of the NTSB are like, NHTSA needs to get its together and start like regulating this in some way, because right now these companies are not violating any rules or laws and there are no standards whatsoever. And that's a huge problem because it's dangerous. And I think like basically NHTSA taking some of those recommendations would be an easy first step.
More coming up with Aaron in just a moment. I just want to take a second to encourage you to subscribe to our feed if you have not already done so. We have a lot of great content coming for you in the near future. In addition to the home of our video feed here on YouTube, we're now available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, whatever other podcast app you use to find content, we are there. We also really want to hear your feedback about how we're doing so far. Questions, comments, suggestions, we really want to hear from you. The easiest way for us to see feedback is to either comment on the YouTube video or to drop us a line on Twitter at The NABE Show or at MTSW, or email us at thenabe@protonmail.com. I read every single piece of feedback we receive. We definitely want to hear what you think. Links to all of those are in the description for this episode. Now back to Aaron. So let's talk a little about some specific infrastructure projects in New York. One of the biggest ones that's I know on the asking list for congressional funding is the Gateway project between New York and New Jersey to replace these like 100-year-old rail tunnels that carry a ton of rail traffic every day. Do you think Gateway is going to be a priority for DOT and Congress to fund, or like the cost estimates for it are also so insanely high? It seems like it's a tough ask at the same time.
Yeah, if you take Senator Schumer and Biden at their word, they say this is a priority. So I'm willing to do that. You know, if they say it's a priority, then I guess that makes it a priority until we see otherwise. In terms of the amount it's supposed to cost, yeah, I think it's $12 billion. Is that 12 somewhere in their $12 or $14 billion range?
It seems like it grows every time I check, so it's tough to keep track of.
Yeah, I mean, I think once you get above a certain point with cost estimates on infrastructure projects, the numbers are kind of made up. Like once you get above, I think it's like $5 billion. They're just making it up at that point. And I think East Side Access is a great example of that. Another New York area transportation project that over a 20-year period has gone from being estimated to cost $3 billion to now $11 billion. And it's supposed to be finished next year, and we'll see how much it actually ends up costing in the end.
For like a 1.5 mile tunnel. Also,
yeah, so that if you're taking the train in from Long Island, you end up 5 blocks over in Manhattan. Yeah, don't get me started on East Side Access. But anyways, so Gateway probably will be a priority, and it probably will get funded because even though the cost estimates are obscene and for the project, many critics of the project say it's way over scoped, like they're building way too much for what's needed, and nobody really knows why. But, it's one of those things where because they have to deal with a critical infrastructure fail point, a lot of other stuff got packaged in with it because that's the way federal funding works, is like you try and stuff the bag as much as you can if you know that a project has to get funded with other stuff that maybe wouldn't get funded on its own. And yeah, I mean, it probably will get funded. It probably, because like once you're talking about federal infrastructure spending, the federal government is not as stingy as, for obvious reasons, local, like state and local governments tend to be, because their budgets don't work the same way because the federal government can just print money. I think $14 billion sounds like a lot to us, and it is a lot of money, but you put it in a $1.9 trillion spending package, and suddenly it doesn't sound like so much money. And so I think that's one of the other things that happens when we go back to like the cost issue. When you start shifting projects to the federal level, cost overruns don't sound so extreme. It's kind of like, it reminds me of when Senator Manchin was talking about how he wants to stimulate the economy with a big infrastructure spending bill rather than sending everyone $2,000 checks. He goes, let's spend a big infrastructure bill. Let's do $2, $3, $4 trillion. And it was like, he got from $2 to $4 trillion in 2 seconds. It's like, those are very different numbers. But it sounds the same at a certain point, and I think
what's another trillion, right?
Right, exactly. What's another trillion between friends? So I think that's like another thing that happens on the federal level too, that makes cost problems a lot less significant, or seem a lot less significant.
Yeah. And to your point about like the over $5 billion, like I saw the other day that there is a plan for a $10 billion rebuilding of the Port Authority bus terminal, which just seems like I don't know if you held a gun to my head and said, spend $10 billion rebuilding this bus terminal. I don't know if I could do it. Like it seems so far out of the universe of what a project like that should cost. But
so this is another good example of something that happens with mega projects. Is this is not like an actual costed estimate. Like they haven't done any actual like work to figure out exactly how much it should cost. They're estimating it'll cost somewhere between $7.5 billion and $10 billion. Now, I guarantee you that the way they arrived at those numbers was not by saying, how much do we think a bus station costs? It was by saying, how much do we need to say it will cost in order to get the amount of money that will allow us to build it? And basically, this is what people who study large infrastructure projects, and I should say projects around the world, this is not a uniquely American phenomenon. You come up with a number that you think is roughly 30 to 50% above what you expect it to cost, because it's always better to ask for more money and get it than to ask for how much you think it will actually cost, find out the inevitable cost overruns occur, and realize you don't have enough money and have to go hat in hand back to the government or whoever's funding the project to finish it. So I think there's a little bit of that going on here too, where like I don't think they're going to get $10 billion to rebuild a bus terminal, but if they say they need $10 billion and between private funding, public funding at various levels, they end up getting $5-6 billion, then that'll probably pay for a new bus station. I would certainly hope so. But it's crazy. I mean, it's absolutely insane to hear. Like, it's the insane thing is not so much that the Port Authority thinks a bus terminal costs $10 billion or says it thinks it costs $10 billion, because we all know what because Port Authority is notorious for overspending on infrastructure projects. What What instead seems even more bizarre to me is that the reaction from most people who write about these things is like, yeah, Port Authority wants $10 billion for a bus terminal. That's cool. And it's like,
yeah, I mean, to your point, like if Joe Manchin is just like, 2 trillion, 4 trillion, what's the difference? Like, if they don't know what the bus terminal is going to cost, Joe Manchin definitely doesn't know what the bus terminal is going to cost. You might as well just ask for the moon. Right,
exactly.
So in addition to like these kind of new federal rail projects in New York, and the MTA and New York City subways kind of like need a bailout right now, and the system is in even worse financial distress than it usually is. Is there a sense that that's going to come in the federal package and maybe even replenish the capital budget a little bit, like Second Avenue Phase 2 or BQX or these other kind of like reach asks that were on the table before COVID and maybe were shelved as a result of state budget deficits?
Well, so there's definitely a sense that like the recent stimulus that got passed was like a stopgap, and that they're going to need more money this year. Not just the MTA, but all transit agencies in the country, because the impacts of COVID on their financials is going to last a lot longer than 2020.
And kind of ironically, like the fact that the MTA was recovering more in user fees than a typical transit agency in the United States was, like has made them worse financially in COVID. So the fact that they were like a little more responsible than maybe some of the smaller transit agencies were has actually boomeranged on them and has really hurt them.
Yeah, I think the way that the CARES Act stimulus works, which was the one back in, what was it, April or May, that one was kind of screwed up in how it assigned out money based on ridership loss, in that it didn't help the big city transit systems with the highest ridership for as long as it helped some of the smaller transit agencies. The stimulus that just got passed corrected that a little bit with some different math that basically accounted for saying basically they'll only fund up to I think it was 75% of lost revenue. So it wasn't as imbalanced in terms of helping the smaller agencies for a longer period of time than it helped the larger agencies. But that is still a problem, and still kind of like one of the ironies is that we've spent the last 50 to 70 years telling transit agencies that they need to cover as much of their own costs through ridership fees and just like cost of doing business as possible, and rely less on the government for revenue. And now during coronavirus, the ones that have done that to the largest degree are the ones that are hurting the most. There's definitely that irony to it. In terms of where the MTA goes from here, I think one of the interesting things I've noticed is that when people tend to write or discuss the MTA's financial problems now, there's kind of this, it's not that people ignore that the MTA was in dire financial straits before, but they seem to kind of understate how bad its finances were before COVID. There's kind of like usually a throwaway line like, although the agency has always had financial problems, or although the agency has been in, has had significant debt before the pandemic. It's like,
and I remember, it's one of those things where it's a little tough to talk about because they've been in dire financial straits for like 70 years consecutively. But right. To your point, it's like worse than it's been in a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I remember watching board meetings in 2018 and 2019 where the CFO was like sounding the doomsday alarm that like by 2022 they weren't going to be able to borrow anymore because they had maxed out their debt. And like how much of this was just like alarmist, alarmist rhetoric to get more money from the state or to get the board to pass fare increases, I think that's kind of hard to say, but it's definitely true that they were paying 16% of their operating budget to service their debt. They had huge debt problems before the pandemic, largely because they had to borrow to finance these construction projects that were costing way more than they expected, and construction was taking way longer than expected. So they weren't getting revenues to, counterbalance it, and it was just wreaking havoc on their annual budgets and their capital budget. And as I think people in New York and maybe people around the country will remember, like there was this huge $50 billion plan to fix a lot of the underlying issues with the subway that came to light in 2017 and 2018. And where that kind of stands at the moment is a huge question mark because, again, like they were going to have to use a lot of debt service to pay for that money. And, how much debt can they take on? How much is going to get bailed out by the government, if any? I think all of that is still kind of an open question. But now's a good time for the federal government and even for, just ordinary people to kind of think about how we want to fund public transit in the future. I mean, the MTA's entire structure is, the public authority model, which, people who read The Power Broker cover to cover will know was created basically to solve a bunch of different problems by combining them into one big problem. And the hope was that doing that would then make the big problem easier to solve. All the little problems would cancel each other out. And Nelson Rockefeller was wrong about a lot of things, and he was wrong about that. And the MTA has just been one big problem since then. And it would be good if we dropped this fiction that the MTA is supposed to pay for itself every year, which is completely ludicrous. It gets billions of dollars in taxes every year, but it still has to balance the budget. It still has to have this capital plan that's largely divorced from reality. Just a lot of the MTA is paper fiction. And I think it would be great to kind of rethink what a transit agency should be in the 21st century in a city where I think most people would agree that it's a public good and not a business, and that it's not supposed to pay for itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine that actually happening right now, though.
It's not going to happen.
Yeah. Do you feel like there's any momentum? Something that I've actually found encouraging is that since the Democrats have taken the state Senate in New York, there's been a lot of action on rent control and rent stabilization. The law has been strengthened a lot. And that's sort of opened up a possibility that didn't seem like it existed before. Is there any sense that the politics in Albany changing could potentially help things out there? Or,
I mean, maybe. I think the most interesting development could happen on the federal level, though. And stick with me a bit while I get in the weeds, but it's important for this conversation. Up to this point, the federal government really didn't help pay for operating costs of agencies. It helped you pay for capital costs like new transit lines, new buses, new trains. And then it pretty much left paying the bus drivers, running service, all those day-to-day costs to the agency itself, or whatever local authority or local government level pays for the service. And that's obviously resulted in very poor transit service in most parts of the country because most cities in the country are still heavily reliant on, or most people in cities are still heavily reliant on private automobiles to get around. So it's very tough politically to spend millions upon millions of dollars every year of taxpayer money on running better transit service, or good enough that people will actually use it. One of the stipulations of a transit bill that passed the House, although its odds in the Senate are long, to say the least, is that more money could go towards transit operations. So federal dollars could go towards helping to pay to run more buses. And I think that kind of change would be one of the biggest changes to federal transportation policy in generations. Because right now, the biggest problem with American transportation is that it's not useful in nearly any city. There are basically 6 exceptions of where you can realistically live as a productive member of society without a car and relying on public transportation.
And these are not necessarily models that you could emulate. A lot of times it's a system from the 1930s that has just, managed to not be destroyed and passed down through the generations.
And there are a lot of big changes that could help. I mean, there are a lot of big things that could help change that too. But I think one of the smaller things is being as agnostic with how states use transportation dollars as it is with how states use highway dollars. So of the federal transportation spending, roughly 80 cents out of every dollar goes towards highways. And when the federal government gives, and it does it through block grants, it just gives states money and it's like, use this on your roads however you see fit. You want to build a new road, go for it. You want to build a new highway overpass, go for it. You want to build a new $3 billion interchange, go for it. You want to use it entirely on maintenance. No one's done this. Go for it. But with transit dollars, it works completely differently. Transit agencies have to apply to the federal government, I think I said this earlier, for funding on specific projects. They have to say, I want to build a new subway that goes from 86th Street to 125th Street. And the federal government reviews the project and says, okay, we'll give you a few $1 billion for that. Now, if the federal government was as agnostic with transit dollars as it was with highway dollars, then in theory, states would get a block grant. And, they could say, we want X number of dollars for whatever. And the federal government would say, here you go, go for it. Or they could make it a formula and you wouldn't even have to ask at all. It would just be automatically sent out like it is with highway dollars. In that case, a city could say, we don't want to build a new subway. We want to use this money to pay like a ton of bus drivers and buses to run like 10-minute service citywide. So everyone, is going to be able to get to where they need to go with frequent, reliable bus service. Do I think a city would do this? Maybe, maybe not, probably not. But it's at least it would at least become an option. And I think giving localities more options about how to spend federal transportation dollars would be a great first step to improving the country's transportation landscape.
Yeah, and that's one of those things where you don't necessarily need everyone to get it right immediately. One city gets it right and that becomes a model for other cities. Like I think you're already seeing that with like Indianapolis's, I think it's the Red Line, the bus rapid transit service, where that was like a very cost-effective project and delivers really good service with like low headways and fast service, which is something that you don't see everywhere. But giving states and localities the ability to experiment with that, I think, is going to be something that pays a lot of dividends. Like we see here in San Diego, we have these new trolley lines, which are great in some sense, but they're also running 10 to 20 minute headways most of the day, which makes them a little less than useful for actual transit versus like a fun ride for the tourists.
Right. And so this is where I think the CARES Act actually sets a really important precedent, because this is what the CARES Act did. It just, it gave this stimulus money to transit agencies and just said, basically like use this to pay your bills. And if we can make that a staple of federal transportation funding rather than a one-time stimulus during a force majeure crisis, that would be a massive sea change. I mean, we saw what the CARES Act did, allowing transit agencies to say, or at least here in New York, the CARES Act funding basically allowed the MTA to say, we don't have to cut service now because because our funding gap has been made up for the next 5 months or 6 months. And then the stimulus package that came through a couple of months ago did the same thing. All these transit agencies from Boston to Chicago, Boston, New York, DC especially, but others too, were warning of these like draconian service cuts that were like would have absolutely decimated the transit landscapes in their cities. But they got money from the federal government, and it was just money that said, here, use this to pay your bills, use this to run your services. And it worked. Service wasn't cut, and the transit landscape is what it was before. Now, if we could just take that a step further and have the federal government continue to give money to transit agencies and say, use this to pay your bills, imagine what else they could do. They could increase service. They could, build more bus lanes. They could improve multimodal station parking, just whatever. Anything that they thought was worth doing, they could do it. There would probably also have to be a lot of rigorous oversight about how they spend the money to make sure they don't waste it on bad transit projects like we talked about this whole conversation. But, that's part of the game. You can't give transit agencies more money. You can't expect better outcomes from transit agencies without giving them more money.
Aaron, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks. This was fun.
Thank you again to Aaron W. Gordon for joining us. I highly recommend following him on Twitter at @A_W_Gordon and checking out his reporting at Motherboard. He is one of the best reporters in the entire country covering transportation. Make sure you are subscribed to our YouTube channel. We'll be posting some bonus content for you in the very near future, featuring a segment from this episode that we had to cut for time, talking about America's favorite governor, Andrew Cuomo, and the question that's on everyone's mind right now. is he trying to kill overnight subway service in New York City? Thanks, as always, to you for watching. I will see you next time.